Chapter 5 The Double V. In the early 1940s, the Hampton Roads area was bustling with newcomers. The cities around the harbor, Newport News and Hampton to the north, and Portsmouth, Norfolk, and Virginia Beach to the south, had welcomed hundreds of thousands of new residents since the start of World War II. Between 1940 and 1942, the region's population had increased by more than 50%. The area had emerged as a powerful military capital, and most of the jobs there were now related to the war. Much of the work belonged to women. The sight of women wearing coveralls and working at filling stations, a job that used to be for men, no longer turned heads. Women now did all kinds of jobs, shined shoes, worked in the shipyard, and staffed offices. With men off to fight on the front lines, woman power picked up the slack. The war operated around the clock, 3 8-hour shifts, and many businesses tried to keep pace. Some stores stayed open long hours. The movie theater showed movies from 11 a.m. to midnight, featuring films with a strong dose of patriotism. Banks stayed open late to cash checks for workers. All of the new residents needed places to live. Landlords doubled their rents and still had long waiting lists. Water systems, electrical plants, schools, and hospitals struggled to keep up with the growing population. The government addressed the shortage by building 5,200 new houses in the east end of Newport News. Of those, 1,200 homes were built for African Americans in a separate subdivision known as Newsom Park. Welcome. Dorothy Vaughan arrived in Newport News on a Thursday and started work at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory the following Monday. The personnel department kept a file of available houses for new employees, divided by race to comply with the custom of segregation. $5 a week got Dorothy a room of her own and 2 meals a day in the home of a black couple in their 60s who were willing to take in a boarder. The house was located in the East End, not far from the newly built housing development Newsom Park. The houses in the city's East End neighborhood were well maintained, surrounded by thriving local businesses, and occupied by members of a growing middle class. City buses and trolleys circulated through the neighborhood from morning until night as employees punched out from one shift and met workers coming in for the next shift. The buses always seemed crowded, and the race-specified laws made commuting more difficult. Whites had to enter and exit from the front of the bus, while blacks had to go in and out of the back behind what was known as the blank line. Those in the back of the bus had to stand if the white section was full. When the buses were short on conductors, blacks had to enter at the front and push their way to the back section, then do the same in reverse to get off the bus. Blacks caught in the white section were fined or arrested. Even whites complained about the jostling and scrambling caused by the rules. Race and patriotism. In Hampton Roads and across the country, relationships between blacks and whites became strained. Overcrowded buses, 6-day work weeks, constant noise and construction, shortages of sugar, coffee, butter, and meat. All of these factors came together to create tension. This was not a new problem. 2 years earlier, in his 1941 State of the Union address, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had promised that men of every creed and every race, wherever they lived in the world, were entitled to 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. He pledged that the United States would help to overcome dictators in other countries who would deny other people their freedoms. African Americans were sympathetic to the needs of oppressed people around the world. They shared in the horror when they learned about the acts of Germans against their Jewish citizens, limiting the jobs they could have, imprisoning them, denying them citizenship, treating them with violence, segregating them into ghettos, working them to death in slave camps, and having them killed. How could Black Americans learn about the way the Jews were treated without comparing some of these experiences to some of their own struggles against slavery, unfair treatment, and violence at home? For generations, African Americans had been promised an end to discrimination. But instead of greater freedom, the period between World War I and World War II, 1918 to 1941, saw segregation harden and become the law of the land. As America made the decision to join the fighting in World War II, African Americans pressured the government to open the war jobs to their community. Leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who had helped make the Fair Employment Practices laws a reality, asked the country to show its patriotism by treating all of its citizens fairly. Black newspapers spoke out on the issue. Help us to get some of the blessings of democracy here at home first, before you jump on the free other people's bandwagon and tell us to go forth and die in a foreign land, said P.B. Young, the owner of the Norfolk Journal and Guide, in a 1942 editorial. Should African Americans fight for freedom overseas when they did not experience it for themselves at home? James Thompson, a 26-year-old cafeteria worker, made his case in a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. Being an American of dark complexion, these questions flashed through my mind. Is the kind of America I know worth defending? Will some Americans suffer still the indignities that have been heaped upon them in the past? These and other questions need answering. I want to know, and I believe every American who is thinking wants to know. What are we fighting for? This was the question asked by many African Americans in private and in public. African Americans were loyal to their country. They had a deep and abiding faith in the possibility of democracy. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and the United States joined the fighting in World War II, the African American community closed ranks, as they had done in previous times of war. They geared up to fight for their country's future and for their own. From this divide between feeling Black and feeling American came the idea of the double victory. James Thompson expressed the idea in his letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. Let some Americans adopt the double V for double victory. The first V for victory over our enemies from without. The second V is for victory over our enemies within. For surely, those who perpetrate these ugly prejudices here are seeking to destroy our democratic form of government just as surely as the Axis forces. Dorothy Vaughan understood the importance of the double V, victory in war and victory in the civil rights struggle at home. By accepting her post as a mathematician, she believed she was working toward both goals. On December 1st, 1943, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and Russia concluded a conference during which they planned a summer invasion of France. It was an invasion that would become a turning point in the war and that eventually became known as D-Day. On the same day, Dorothy Vaughan stepped behind the line on the bus and headed to her first day of work at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory.